Hello, this is basic setup for the VP Networks UTM-5000 Unified Threat Manager. This video is intended for a public access network, usually provided as an amenity, so it would be appropriate for something like a hotel or access at a cafe or another public network, where you don't really have any control over who's coming and going from the network, and you want to have features that maximize people's access. So the UTM-5000 Unified Threat Manager is a combination device that combines a ton of network functionality to really give you an all-in-one device for network security. It includes standard routing as well as a load balancer for multiple connections and failover, firewall functionality for protecting incoming and outgoing connections, as well as more sophisticated features like content filtering, intrusion protection and intrusion detection, antivirus, and many more features. For basic users, it has a ton of pre-configured basic functionality. For advanced users, it has tremendous depth. You could really use it to run an entire small or large enterprise system. So the first thing you want to do is, I assume you've reviewed the basic setup in the manual, and you can connect to your UTM-5000 with a LAN cable. Most likely you're connected to port 3, which by default is configured as the first LAN port. So you need to go to the IP address. This one's at 10.1, but the default address is 192.168.100.1. That's probably where you would be connecting. Then log into your unit. The default username is admin. The default password is admin99. You can log in using those credentials. The first thing you'll see is a dashboard. This gives you a summary of the unit with some basic usage information. You can see if ports are up. Also, if there's any administrative tasks that need to be done. So the first thing that you'll want to do is go ahead and change the password, especially if you set up your UTM so that it's accessible through the WAN port. People will be seeing it as an active web server and trying to hack it more or less all the time. So you can change your password under admin user management. You see in here the standard administrator. If you want to change it to something else, just click on the user, click on modify. Well, this is the properties. If you want to change the password, click on change password. You can enter a new password here. You can also create additional users if you want. Sometimes it's useful to have someone on site who's not technical. Maybe they need status information, so you can add additional users and give them admin privileges or make them read-only, so they can only see reports and tables and things. Give them a special password, so you can do that as well. So the next task that you'll want to do is, if you don't want the standard setup, which is 2 WAN ports and 2 LAN ports, you can change that on your unit under Ethernet port management. You can see on my unit I have LAN 1 is set up as LAN 1. Then I have 3 WAN ports. On yours you probably have a LAN 1 and a LAN 2. So what you can do, in my case I turned LAN 2 into LAN 1, meaning port 4, and then I turned LAN 1 into WAN 3. So now I have 3 WAN ports, port 1, 2, and 3, and 1 LAN port. So you could give yourself an additional LAN port as well, just depending if you're not doing any load balancing. So set your ports up the way you want here in terms of LAN and WAN ports. Once you've done that, you'll want to configure the WAN ports. You're connected on the LAN port now, so you go to configuration, go to network settings, and in here you can see basically the possible setups. If you don't have a WAN 2 or 3, these settings won't do anything. In our case, we have a WAN 1. It's set up as a static IP. So we put in the settings that we got from our internet service provider here. There's some more advanced options here you can look at, but in general it's not necessary to change these. If you're going to do load balancing between multiple connections, you'll want to set the link priority. If you're doing failover only, this will determine which port is active first. So if you have a high-speed fiber connection that's 100 megabits, and then you have a slow backup connection that's 10 megabits, you could set them to priority 1 and 2 so that the faster connection would be on unless it failed, and then you could switch over to the slower connection. If you're going to use load balancing rather than failover, so you have two simultaneous connections and you want to split up data between them, then the link priority will determine the ratio between the two links. So if you have them both set to 1, then the ratio will be set to 1/2 for each of those links. If you set them both to 100, then the ratio will still be split evenly. It'll just be 100 out of 200. But for instance, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to set this to the line speed. So if you have a 50 megabit connection and a 10 megabit connection, you could set them to 50 and 10. And then what that'll do is give you 10/60 for one connection and 50/60 for the second connection. So that's how the link priority works. So in our case, we also have a PPPoE connection. You may need to change the MTU for your PPPoE, or you may not. That's a question for your ISP. And these other settings, sometimes it's useful if you're on something like a satellite. You can actually set how much bandwidth is available or that you want to use per month. Sometimes you pay for satellite time. You might get a block, of a gigabit, and then beyond that it might be $1 a megabyte. So you could set that here if that's necessary. So once you have the WAN ports set up the way you want to configure the LAN port. So this one's set to 10.1.1. By default, yours will be set to 192.168.100.1. Just change this to match the settings for your LAN network, or if you have another router connected to your network. For instance, if you're using one of our gateway controllers, you'd want to configure this to use the subnet that you're using for the WAN port on that device. You can choose whether or not to use DHCP, just depending on whether there's another server on the network. But these settings are pretty standard. Just set these to match whatever you have set on your existing network. So once you basically have your network connection set up, you want to configure the load balancing if you're doing load balancing. And like I said, you can set it to load balance. In my case, I'm using both of my two connections. I had WAN 1 and WAN 2, so I'm using these two connections. If I set this up to failover, then whichever link had the higher priority would be used until it was detected that it was down. Another setting that you might want to consider as well is there's a setting to determine how failures in the link are detected. There isn't necessarily a right answer on how to look for failures. If the gateway provided by your ISP supports ping, you can do that. ARP sometimes is safer because even devices that don't want to be pinged will respond to ARP. Some customers use a remote IP, like a Google or something else, just as a way to tell if maybe their gateway from their ISP is up, but the actual ISP connection is down. That's probably not that common, but you could also ping something like, one of the Google DNS addresses. Just keep in mind that if you're pinging someone else's address, it's an address you don't control, so they could stop accepting your pings at any time. So just keep that in mind. If you do have some kind of a NOC device that you do host, you might want to ping that instead, because at least you know that you can set up that device so it'll always take your pings. So that only affects the load balancing in terms of figuring out when one of the links might be down. If you're using a 3610, a gateway controller, or if you have some other reason why you want to pass through static IP addresses, you can do that using IP pass-through, and basically just add a rule. So give it a name you could name it for your 3610, and then, say you have a static you could pass through 66 through 68. Tell it what WAN port these IPs are coming in on. You might have multiple ranges, and then tell it to bypass the firewall. Then what will happen is these incoming static addresses will get passed off to the internal interface, which is probably one of your LAN ports. And then if you're using something like a VPN static IP, or if you were passing static traffic to another device, you might have a web server or a camera or something that's externally accessible. You could pass that traffic to those devices without getting any, routing or firewall or content control interference from the UTM-5000. If you don't have any of those devices, then you don't need this particular setting. There's some other advanced settings in here as well, as far as static routes and policy-based routes. Those are a little more advanced, so a standard configuration doesn't necessarily need that. We'll probably cover those in another video for more advanced settings. So if you are also using a device behind your UTM-5000, particularly if you're using one of our gateway controllers from VP Networks, you may have ports that you want to forward. For instance, you might have an AP monitor table that lists all of your access points, and you can access them remotely through ports on your gateway controller. So if you add a UTM-5000 to that system, you'll want to forward those same ports. And all you need to do is just add a port forward rule. So we call this one 3610. We could call it APs. We don't need any of these settings. TCP is fine, but you can always set it to TCP and UDP. You want it going from the WAN. You're going to send this to the LAN port. And then you'll want to specify the ports that you're using. For instance, AP ports on the gateway controller are, typically, 60,001 through 60,050. It really depends on what ports you're using, but those are typically open ports. And then you'll want to enter the IP of the device of your gateway controller, which on this network might be 10.1.1.2. We're going to send it to the same port, so port 60,001 on our UTM-5000 is going to get delivered to port 60,001 on our gateway controller, which is at 10.1.1.2. And then the port forwarding on your gateway controller presumably is configured to talk to your access point, so that traffic will get passed along. You may have additional devices on your network that need forwarded ports. You might have cameras, or you might have web servers, or other devices. As I said before, you could put those devices on static IPs, but this is a way where they don't need public IP addresses. You can just forward those ports through your UTM-5000. Again, there's some more advanced settings in here that you could use, but you don't need those for a basic setup. A useful option is to show the configuration for the firewall. This is kind of an easy way to see all your rules in one place, but you can see all these tables in the individual menus as well. So another option that you'll want to configure is a system security. This determines how you can access your UTM-5000 from outside the network. So you can see right now my UTM-5000 is not manageable from the WAN port, either by HTTP or HTTPS. It's also worth noting the default HTTPS port is 4433. Your browser won't look for that by default, so change that to 443 if you want your browser to connect by default, or leave it as 4433 for a little bit more security. If you're going to be logging into your UTM from the WAN port, you'll need to enable either HTTP or HTTPS. Like I said, that's why it's good to change the password, because as soon as you do that, your device is going to be exposed to any web requests coming in from the internet. So if you want to have group-specific rules, if you want to have certain groups of users, or if you want to have a global set of rules to control access, and those kinds of rules would be things like control of content or control of bandwidth usage. You can configure those under web security. So if you click on HTTPS proxy, this is enabled by default, so this has to be enabled to allow any of the content filtering or the other group rules to function. You'll see that the category list comes from a subscription database. As long as your UTM-5000 subscription is current, you'll get this data automatically downloaded from the server. There isn't anything that you need to configure especially to enable that to work. So if you want to set rules for groups that affect everyone, just go to Group Rules, click on Edit to edit the rule. And on this menu, it's important to scroll down because there's a lot more options down here. You may see this on other menus as well. Just when you're configuring options, keep an eye out to see if there is a scroll bar. Sometimes it's easy to miss. So for this default group that everyone belongs to automatically, you can see we don't have a per user limit or a group limit. Those could be set if you want. We're not forcing any content filtering rules or access time restrictions. These are all things that could be set as well. If you want to do content filtering, there are some standard, lists of blacklists. For things like a library, you might have a requirement to block certain kinds of sites. Just for your own safety, you might want to block, things like malware. So we could block known malware sites. What else could we block? Known phishing sites. These all come from your subscription, so they're updated, I think almost every day, maybe every week. For something like a library, you also might need, to block things like, pornography. I guess that's blocked by default. So if you do enable this feature, you'll block pornography by default. If you want to enable pornography, oh, I see, I put these in the allowed section. So if we want to block all these, we'll add them to blocked. And we had phishing on here as well. So you can take a look through this list just to see the kinds of content you can block and make an assessment for your site. If you do want to block this kind of content, it really depends on what's required for your site. You can also create additional groups as well. If you want to enable these groups, just edit them and turn on the additional groups. There's more complex rules about how to lump users into groups. You can do it based on IP or based on logins. or using other criteria if you do have separate groups who need separate rules. Um, so another area functionality is the intrusion detection system or the intrusion prevention system. This will stop things more like hackers or denial of service attacks. So popular options to enable, I think by default you have some denial of service attacks and various exploits. It's pretty common to also try to block botnet requests in case you have any infected devices on your network. Also, blocking peer-to-peer file sharing is also a popular option for public networks. There's additional content you can block as well. You can block, phishing spam messages. You could block POP3 if you wanted. That would block your email. So there's a lot of different rules in here. You also might want to block, incoming viruses. So this is separate from the actual virus scanner. This more looks for data, patterns, and packets as opposed to virus content. But so these are all options. You could, rather than blocking them, you can also just get alerts that'll show up in the log when that traffic is detected. So there's this pretty extensive set of rules in the UTM-5000. If you want to get something that's kept up to date in a similar way to the content filtering lists, you can subscribe to OINC, which is a third-party service. So you would need to set up your OINC account. I'm not sure if it's free or not. There may be a monthly subscription, but in any case, if you do want your IDS system to have more of a weekly or monthly update, you can subscribe to OINC and set that up here. Otherwise, the internal rules are sufficient for most applications. So beyond these IDS rules, you can also filter out specific applications as you want. I'd say this probably is not common, but if you have a reason why you need to block Skype or you need to keep people off Facebook, which is probably a mistake on a public network, but if you have some requirement for that. Windows Update sometimes is popular to disable. Sometimes that can use up a lot of bandwidth on your network. And then under IPS, you can also, let's see. And here's also the antivirus signatures. Again, you'll get these automatically with your subscription. If you did have some reason to disable it, you could do that. So the next area that you'll probably want to enable is to do some antivirus. Enable that separately for POP3, as well as SMTP. So those are the two. Those are incoming and outgoing emails. If you have a reason not to enable one or the other, you can certainly do that. You can also have some control over, the size of messages you want to look for. You can also filter for spam. Again, you can configure this in terms of, what kind of spam you're looking for. But these can all help with getting ISP complaints that viruses are coming out of your network or that spams are being generated by your network. So this is a good option to enable usually for a public network. So once you've enabled all of these features, you can also get some reports and logs. You can get those via email if you enable this, and then configure your configure your mail ID and your password, and then you can configure what kind of you can register alerts that you want to receive. Like I said, you can, for the intrusion detection system, you can configure it just to record alerts. for some kind of traffic and block other kinds of traffic, so you can get these alerts via email. You can also get emailed reports from the gateway controller, or you can see the FTP log. And so that pretty much covers basic functionality. That should get your UTM-5000 set up, enable most of the features that you're going to need. Once you have all that configured, it should pretty much, load balance your connections and, start to block content that that you don't want. A couple additional things you might want to look at is some people use a scheduled reboot. If you're finding, that you're having to restart the unit, once a week or once a month, you can set it to restart itself. You may also need, if you don't have a current subscription license for whatever reason, or you upgrade it later in the future, you can upload your license file here. If you have any add-ons, that's where you would update those. So that pretty much covers the basic configuration. Hopefully that answered any questions you had about how to get your UTM-5000 up and running. And please do view some of our additional videos or contact us at support@valuepointnetworks.com for more help.